So we were discussing as to how the carbon footprint calculator can calculate the carbon footprint from the food. And what I would be discussing today is how to write a code for doing the calculations of carbon footprint from food. We had already said that the carbon footprint from food would depend upon what kind of food one is consuming, and it has been shown that if a person consumes a more animal based food, then he or she has a higher footprint than if the consumption is of the plant based food. Okay, and I had provided you some data. Now, the question is, if you are programming for the carbon footprint calculator, and if you want to generate or write a code for the carbon footprint calculator, which would give you ultimately what is the carbon footprint from the food, then what could be the typical code one can write, and how do we write that? So I had just used an example of a carbon footprint code written in Python, and this any language would do. For example, you can use any language, C or whatever, whichever language you are comfortable with, programming language, for writing the code. And you would understand that it is pretty easy to write a code if the concepts are very clear. So what are the concepts which are necessary for calculating the carbon footprint from food? One has to give an input of the specific emission factor or specific CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent, for the different categories of food. And if the list is exhaustive, your calculations would be more accurate. If you can also make a very simple program wherein one can just put a number of emission factor for the vegetarian food and for the non-vegetarian food, or for the vegan diet, like this, and then the code could be a pretty it could be of simple 2 or 3 line code. But here I have tried to write a code which is more elaborate based on the different food categories. So you see that I had given an input of CO2 equivalents for the different categories of food. For beef, I had given the input of 27, that would be the CO2 emissions per kg. For lamb, it is 39.2, whatever. Okay, so whatever numbers one can get from the data, and this data would always be updated, right? But for the present calculations, in my code, I have given some numbers. For beef, I had taken the CO2 equivalent as 27. For lamb, I had taken it as 39.2. For pork, I had taken it as 5.7. For chicken, 6.9. Fish, eggs, milk, cheese, rice, wheat, potatoes, vegetables, and fruits. So these are the different food categories I have included in my code, wherein I have asked the I have defined the CO2 emissions in my Python. Okay. Once you define that, then the next thing is we should give the command as to what is to be done. Okay. So the command is you need to define a function to calculate the carbon footprint for a meal, right? So this carbon footprint is basically we would be calculating for a meal, right? And there, as you see, this is pretty clear that the user is required to enter, okay, as seen in the code, the amount of beef he or she consumes, the amount of potatoes he or she consumes, and the amount of vegetables he or she consumes, whatever. Okay, the from the list he or she can choose the quantity he or she consumes per meal, right? And the meal could be one meal, it could be an annual meal, whatever, right? Total one can recollect for a month, for a day, and accordingly you will get the carbon footprint, a daily carbon footprint, or a meal wise the carbon footprint, like this. And once you do that, then what it would do is that it would multiply it with the corresponding emission factor as seen from the code, okay, and is divided by 1000 in order to get the value in tons of CO2 emitted, right? Because you know that 1000 kgs is 1 ton. And then or you can also ask for the input in grams, right? Like if you are getting an input in grams of food, then also if you want to express the CO2 in kgs of equivalent, then also you need to divide it by 1000. So if I take the food quantity in grams, then I divide it by 1000, I get the carbon footprint in kgs of CO2 equivalent. If I put the input in kilograms and then divide it by 1000, you will get the CO2 equivalent in tons of carbon footprint like this. Okay. So here, because in my example I have given the input in grams, right? So my conversion is by 1000 I would get the CO2 equivalent in kgs, right? Uh, and this is the final command I put. I calculate the carbon footprint of the meal, okay, and finally print the result. So this is a simple code. You can, if you are familiar with the Python code, you know that these are the simple commands which can be input to the carbon footprint calculator for arriving at the carbon footprint of the food which one consumes, right?